Hey everyone, and welcome to React Native Radio. This is Josh Justice. I am the sole panelist for today. And as a guest today, we have Calvin Yu. Calvin, say hello.
Hi. Hi, everybody. How's it going?
One of the biggest pain points that I find as I talk to people about software is deployment. It's really interesting to have the conversations with people where it's, I don't want to deal with Docker. I don't want to deal with Kubernetes. I don't want to deal with setting up servers. I don't, all of these different things. And in a lot of ways, DevOps has gotten a lot easier. And in a lot of ways, DevOps has also kind of embraced a certain amount of culture around applications, the way we build them, the way we deploy them. And I've really felt for a long time that developers need to have the conversations with DevOps or adopt some form of DevOps so that they can take control of what they're doing and really understand when things go to production, what's going on, so that they can help debug the issues and fix the issues and find the issues when they go wrong and help streamline things and make things better and slicker and easier so that they'll more generally go right. So we started a podcast called Adventures in DevOps. And I pulled in one of the hosts from one of my favorite DevOps shows, Nell Shamrell Harrington from the Food Fight Show, and we got things rolling there. And so this is more or less a continuation of the Food Fight Show where we're talking about the things that go into DevOps. So if you're struggling with any of these operational type things, then definitely check out Adventures in DevOps. And you can find it at adventuresindevopspodcast.com.
Well, Calvin, we like to start out giving folks a chance to tell us a bit about themselves. So, who are you? What do you do? Why are you famous? All that good stuff.
Famous is, I wouldn't call myself famous, but let's see, I'm a software consultant, mainly in the Ruby on Rails world, but I have a lot of experience from native mobile development to React development. Let's see, how do I get started? I got started way back in the .com days. That's how I first got into the business, and just meandered, from working for large corporate companies to small startups. And that's where I really found my niche. And the last few years, I've been mainly doing consulting, sort of leveraging all the experience that I've had working with various platforms and products and problem solve. Use my different problem solving skills to try to apply it to a broader audience.
Yeah, Calvin and I worked together during a 6-month contract of mine years and years ago at a company here in Atlanta. And so that's why I wanted to invite you on to get you to share. So I've never actually made it into the startup world. Like when you say startups, are you talking about 2 or 3 or 4 person startups, or not quite that small?
2 to 3 to, in the 20s and 7, so varying range. I've done a lot of the small ones just because my skill set is broad enough to where I can apply it to different disciplines, and that's something I really enjoy doing. I have a wide array of interests.
Yeah, that's definitely something we share. Although I haven't been put through the challenge of being CTO or technical founder in that way. So I imagine at that point you're starting out with making all the technical decisions, right? The founder or you and someone else together have ideas for what to do, and you're deciding what technology should we even use for? Should it be a web app? Should it be a native app? That kind of stuff.
Yes. And one of my startups, I took a lot of pride in it, and that we were originally working on a cross-platform mobile solution, which sounds very, very familiar to to the point of this podcast, called Appcelerator. And one of the first things that I did, decisions I made was to actually switch away from it to a native iOS and a native Android. Actually, more native iOS. We're going to continue to run Android on Appcelerator for a certain time, just to trial going native. I thought that was a good idea at that point, just because this was a startup that was venture funded, and we were growing really fast. And at that time, having a great experience on a mobile app spoke volumes, and it was really good. It was really necessary sort of to attract attention of users. And then later, as things sort of evolve, that became less important. And so when I saw, when we saw React Native, the ideas of how do you manage, the technical scope of what you're doing becomes a little bit more relevant. So you sort of start looking at these technologies in a different light.
I was going to ask about that actually. So as we can get into React Native specific stuff in just a moment, but I'm curious, I've worked as a just developer on a team, even someone like within a larger organization making technical decisions about where to steer things. But like moving into a startup like that, where you're making those technical decisions from scratch, what difference do you need in your mindset? Like, what is it that may not be obvious to most developers that they need to think differently if they're kicking off a startup?
I think when you're just starting out, you might not know all the answers. And honestly, you sort of realize later on that not everybody, even the people that have experience, they really don't know all the answers as well. You just need to pick a decision that makes the most sense to you and just run with it. And you need to have a commitment to just push it as far as you're willing to go, and and be accountable for it. And if you trust in your skills, you push, you're committed to it, you'll push through, and then it'll work out all in the end. And if you make a mistake, just learn from it and move on.
When you're picking those initial technologies, and this is one of those broad sweeping questions that you just let me know if it's ridiculous. How much would you tend to lean on, hey, like, this is a technology that's familiar to me and it's proven and well established and low risk, so let's go with that, versus, hey, this is something new. It offers like really unique new abilities that other platforms and languages and frameworks in the past have not. Let's go with this for our technology to really get a leg up on the competition, even if it's riskier. Do you have any general principles for whether you lean more to one side or the other when picking your initial tech stack for a startup?
No, this is all a case by case basis. You sort of, over time, you sort of get a feel for it, and there's so many factors involved. And as far as like how fast do you want to move your product along, because if you work on a platform that you're very familiar with, you can just knock things out really quickly. Whereas when you work with new technologies, you struggle a bit early on. But what you hope for is that you gain it back as you learn, and it becomes a key value or a key asset of your technology team. And also the other thing is that when you're hiring, people want to work on new stuff. So that's another factor. You can't work on a lot old platforms and expect to be able to attract the best and the brightest. They always want, everybody wants to work on the newest thing, and for good reason. These are things that are built on top of solid research, solid understanding of what the problems are of today's software problems and how to solve them. Otherwise you're working on solving stuff that people have already done a lot of research on.
That makes sense. This all reminds me of a blog post from 2015 that was really impactful for me by Dan McKinley. It's called "Choose Boring Technology." It sounds like that's leaning on one side of that dilemma that I shared there. We'll put the link to it in the show notes. But he actually mentions the idea that in there of like, consider yourself to have like 3 innovation tokens. And so it's like, in general, like, you don't need to innovate in every area of your app at once, even if it might be exciting to some folks. So finding the areas where a new technology really makes a difference. Like maybe it is high throughput, or maybe it is the real-time nature. And so maybe like those aspects of your product, of your startup, are really strategic and are really needed for the experience of the end users and for adoption. So innovate in those, but then other things like the admin user interface or like the user management system. It's like, okay, maybe you don't need to innovate in those because those aren't the core part of your business. And so choose boring technologies for those, so that the risk of the bleeding edge technologies you choose is really strategic. It's the areas of your app where it really has the potential to pay off and differentiate you. So I don't know if the blog post is specifically about startups, but like that's a really appealing thing to me. And even if the trade-offs are a bit different, like that mindset seems like it would apply.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I definitely agree.
So let's get back to React Native. You mentioned how you went to a native iOS app rather than this other cross-platform mobile solution. Because that experience in the mobile app was, having that be as good as possible was really necessary. That definitely makes sense to me. As someone who kind of works across a number of different platforms, like I am happy to acknowledge that, like, on the one hand, like, React Native is using like the native code under the hood. It's like non-critical paths usually that the JavaScript code is executing on. And so it's like most of the time for a lot of apps, you're going to get really great performance from React Native. And yet on the flip side, the new architecture that they're working on comes out of real performance downsides, real challenges with the asynchronous nature of React Native's bridge and everything like that. And certainly if you're just the fact that different kinds of apps are so different, like if you're working on an internal app for a company that employees use, well, yes, you're going to benefit from good performance. You don't want it to hang for them for 15, 30 seconds. But at the same time, like if there's a little bit of flicker as you're scrolling down through a table view, it's not the worst thing. On the flip side, if you're trying to become a top 10 app in the App Store and the app is your whole business, like people are not going to be your customers unless they're using the app and attracted to it. That's a case where you may need to say, like, you want to know that you have the option to have like as maximum performance and usability as possible and using the very latest platform features on Android and on iOS. So I could see that being a case where, using the native code would really be strategic. Any cost, any difficulty hiring, any cost for, taking longer to develop, like you're going to know for sure for you and for your founder, for the company leaders, for your users, that you're getting the absolute maximum performance. Yeah. How does that match up with your experience?
Yeah, that matches up pretty well. And what I generally push is that if you the thought that the app experience is really core to what you're doing, and the way I see it these days is that really what you really want to do is get the core of what your app is doing working and getting it working the way that the customers want it to work, and that's more important than actually the experience itself. Like it's great if it looks great and fancy, but if it doesn't do the things that the user wants to do, they're not going to use it. So, and the thing is that you're not going to nail it right off the bat, right? Exactly what what the user wants. You have to most likely iterate, and you want to do that on a platform that works out the best. So I would like to challenge the clients to make sure that this is really what they want. And the chance, the likelihood that you'll have to rework the app again is pretty high as you progress. And the other thing I like to mention is that I remember there was a statistic that says that nowadays, on average, a typical smartphone user installs less than one app every year. So if you look at it like that, what it tells me is that if you're trying to build a business based on an app itself, it's a tough business to crack in. So you have to what you're offering has to expand beyond the app itself. So it's not just the app that you're working on. It's a server product, it's a website, maybe a website product, or maybe a desktop app. So how much do you want to spread your technical sprawl basically into all these to all these other technology stacks, when you could sort of at least at the initial beginning, when you have a small tech team, to just sort of harness like the core skill set that you have, and sort of leverage technologies to build out your product and discover what your product's going to do, and then figure out what to do next.
That context you shared just makes so much sense. And that's another aspect that's not as obvious to me, not having worked in startups, although I've definitely heard that. The idea of finding that product market fit, like figuring out what the users even want, getting that working, getting the benefit of having a small team that can share their technologies across the web and across native. There's more and more experiments in the React Native world with how to do that, which is really great. The idea that for a startup, you're most likely going to rewrite your app one way or the other. And so you might as well focus on, for the early versions, things that will allow you to iterate faster. I know that this is something that's been described a lot with React Native, live reloading and hot reloading in the development cycle, code push and other technologies for updating JavaScript over the wire that can help with that as well. I have one more thing, kind of general thing to say, and then we can maybe jump into those React Native specifics. This all reminded me of something that a coworker pointed me to last year about like a hierarchy of a user interface experience, a hierarchy of user needs. And we'll share the link in the show notes as well. But it sort of hits on what you said there, that it's like before, the user cares if the table view is 60 frames per second scrolling, they care if it's doing something useful for you. And so if the first version of your app, you don't want it to have terrible performance, but if the first version of your app has a little bit of flicker, but it lets you figure out what the user needs faster and get it in front of them, like they're not going to care about the performance if the app is not something that's useful to them. So I think that idea of focusing on what the user needs and what they're going to care about first makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So before we get into React Native specifics, let's talk about kind of the history of how you got there. Like, do you remember kind of when you first started using React Native and like where it was in its kind of maturity and life cycle, and what was it like for you to get into React Native?
So at that point, I had done some React. I was working on a couple of React apps on top of Electron to actually render some kiosk displays. And then I got approached with this project of building it was the general problem was to build an internal iOS application that did some administrative functionality for an internal team of contractors, basically. Not actually software contractors, but more like home do-it-yourself kind of contractors, home repair contractors. And I was sort of for that kind of app, it seemed overkill to want to do that all in native iOS. Also, I definitely see the possibility that they will want this eventually Android. It was actually communicated they want to do it in Android. So this was a good way to sort of lead into this technology, that I've heard of. Hey, look, we can do this thing in React, which I know works really well for building applications, and then leverage it in a way for building native iOS application and Android applications. And I dove in having no idea what I was getting into. And after a couple of Expo upgrades and working with different UI libraries, I sort of it was sort of like a trial by fire, start trying to figure out what's going on. And then honestly, that's the best way I've learned, sort of understand, like, okay, what is the positives and the negatives of this platform. So that's how I got started. Then from there on, you sort of build on top of that. Okay, what is the next thing? How do you do state management? How do you do how do you get better at using component libraries and all those other concerns. So yeah, that's how I got started.
Coming away from your experience of React Native, the framework has evolved a lot over the last couple of years. What do you think are some of the enduring kind of pros and cons or enduring deciding factors that you would take away as far as when to reach for React Native on a project and when to reach for something else?
Yeah, I think React Native is an ideal solution when it comes to building cross-platform native apps. So there might be other technologies that are better now. Flutter comes into mind when it comes to like doing more custom UI or game designs. But I think from building very usable apps and being able to have reusable components across different, even within an app and then across different projects, I think React Native is very well tuned for reusability.
A couple of years ago, I put out a survey asking people what topics they wanted us to cover on devchat.tv, and I got 2 overwhelming responses. One was from the JavaScript community. They wanted a React show. And the other one was from the Ruby community, and they wanted an Elixir show. So we started both. The React show, though, is React Roundup. And every week, we bring in people from the React community, and we have conversations with them about React, about the community, about open source, about what goes into React, how to build React apps, and what's going on and changing in the React community. So if you're looking to keep current on the current React ecosystem and what's going on in React, you definitely need to be checking out React Roundup. You can find it at reactroundup.com.
And then also, like from a programming models perspective, I think it has a lot more. It's a lot more robust than the other technologies where it's more HTML focused or DOM focused. Whereas what's great about React in general is that it's really just native. It's just really JavaScript code. And then when you need to use a view, you use a DOM-like language to sort of denote that. And to me, that's the molding of the best of both worlds. And then instead of the inverted scheme that the other frameworks where it's you have a DOM or HTML tying everything together. I think from a programming standpoint, from building native apps, that works a lot better.
You mentioned the benefits of Flutter for when you need to build a custom UI, like something where all the widgets are like totally unique and things like that. That's one of the interesting trade-offs between React Native and Flutter that I've seen. And I'm not convinced one way or the other yet, like which is more beneficial. And I mean, I think you've given an idea of when, where the fact that React Native is using real native widgets, like real buttons, real native text inputs and all the equivalent things, even when you're using something platform specific like an iOS tab bar, it's a real iOS tab bar that ultimately gets put onto the screen. And so there's benefits there. But then on the Flutter side, there's benefits for the fact that it's rendering everything from scratch. And so you're less likely to run across, platform specific idiosyncrasies. And so I think that just comes down to like the mental model of what you're thinking about. The React Native team has used the phrase from the beginning. It's not write once, run anywhere. It's learn once, write anywhere. And so in that phrasing, it's more related to thinking about it as you have an iOS app and an Android app. There's a whole sliding scale of where apps land on that spectrum though. And, Expo is kind of, there can be iOS and Android specific code, but like Expo, I feel like is more on the sliding scale towards, no, you've got one app. Like maybe Expo is a good fit for when there are a lot of similarities between the iOS and the Android side. And Flutter might even be a further extreme in that regard, in that like you're not trying to reach for those platform specific widgets at all. Like that's not the main use case.
I think that's one of the benefits of React Native. They didn't say, didn't want to try to fit you into this, this narrow path where, if you try to go native, you're going off the reservation, right? So it's like, okay, you can go and we say, hey, go do what you need to do. And then hopefully you come back and try to, have the common elements running through very, the same channel of code, basically. And another thing I wanted to mention about with Flutter and its difference with React Native, it reminds me of it's very similar to my background way back in the day when the .coms was Java. So it reminds me of the differences between Swing and then before that, Java had another UI framework called AWT, and then after that, they had another one developed by IBM called SWT, and SWT and AWT were more native, so they're more like the React Native version, whereas Swing was the Flutter version. And one of the weird issues with Swing was that it didn't behave native, and it was sort of very obvious in certain places, and you end up with those weird things where when code goes wrong, you start up moving the windows around, and you sort of have the window duplicating effect. That's pretty awesome and annoying at the same time.
Definitely.
So that's what sort of reminds me of when I look at Flutter. At the same time, it's, to me, I think what's gonna the thing that's going to win out really is the ecosystem. And I think this is where React Native with a Java, and working on JavaScript, which is a super approachable language, is really going to help it grow as far as the ecosystem. I think that's the key right now between technologies like Flutter and React Native. It's like, how will their ecosystems grow, and how will they build on top of the things that people have started, and to make mobile development faster and easier.
Yeah, and not just the JavaScript ecosystem, but the whole React ecosystem as well. Anything that's not user interface specific. But I love using Formic for my forms on React Native as well as on React. Everything in the data layer comes over directly, and there's just so much there because the React ecosystem is so. I'm not good enough at history to say for sure that it's unprecedented, but it sure seems like it. It's so dominant that even though Vue.js is getting huge and has a ton of traffic, React is still so much huger. And so I feel very confident recommending React as a web technology to companies, knowing that I cannot see it going away in the next 10 years. It is going to be there. It's still going to be huge, no matter how huge any possible thing in the future comes around. And so being able to build on top of that on the React Native side just provides such a safe foundation. Yeah,
I definitely agree. I having experience with Vue and AngularJS, I definitely enjoy React so much more than the other two. I think mainly because I'm writing just regular JavaScript code, and whereas I'm not tying things together between HTML files or template files or Vue. It's the Vue ML files. Can't remember what they're called anymore, but yeah.
So as we are both Rubyists in our background, I need to ask you about this. Rails is huge on the server side, and Rails is a very prescriptive kind of batteries included approach. Like you get Rails and you have everything you need. React is very much at the other extreme, whereas like React is at various times it's been described as like just the UI layer, just the view layer, or even as evolutions of React are kind of pulling a few more concerns into it. But React itself is certainly not trying to provide everything you need out of the box, and neither is React Native. So I'm curious if you have a sense of like what, and I forget, maybe you've moved away from preferring that on the server side, but like what is it about React that maybe makes it appealing to you, even though it doesn't have all the batteries included, or maybe because of the fact that it doesn't have it all included?
I think I'm sort of there's two sides of this pulling against each other. Like I know there's a lot of people that do like it because of that, but I actually like it more because of the potential that it could be, all the pieces can be put together. Like that's my hope. I am still big on the convention over configuration aspect of Ruby, and I sort of figured my thinking is that this problem has been solved from the context of web applications in this way. For web applications, this convention over configurations, everybody knows what what's entailed with building a web application, and this is the way to do it. And whether it doesn't necessarily have to be Rails. There's plenty of other platforms as far as there's Laravel, and then there's Django on the Python side. But my hope is that that we sort of get there with React Native to where we can have that thing. Remember in the Ruby on Rails days, it was the blog application. So we would have like build your own Instagram, and it's all about pulling all these components that exist and then having them have a big, huge starter kit that gets you going with the what everybody considers like standard. And early on in the Ruby on Rails, it had an opportunity to fracture, and it sort of came together. Just because this is what people needed. People needed to be able to jump into this platform to Rails to be able to understand how to solve the rudimentary problems quickly, so they can get to the meat of their problem faster. And so that's really where we need. And I think it's going to be a combination of all these libraries getting to mature, and looking at React Native or React in general, they're still working on, okay, what are the things that are tripping people up? And let's introduce those new things, as far as like context and hooks, and saying, okay, this these things are making the platform better. Now, what layer on top of that can we add on top of that to make mobile application development better? And it's all about it's all tooling and ecosystem. And that's my hope is that we get there at some point.
This reminds me, at the Chain React conference, I asked one of the Facebook engineers there. He was actually asking us as non-Facebook engineers what our pain points were with React and React Native. And I shared this, that like, hey, I love convention. Like, I feel like I have to pick my own stack in the React world. And he made an interesting point that I hadn't thought of before, where he said that like, in Facebook itself, you're not reinventing the wheel every time you start a new like subsection of the app in React or React Native. Like they have standards, like they have reusable components and layers that have been built out. And so they have things to reach for there. Those just aren't things that necessarily make sense to open source, because either they're very Facebook specific, or they just know that Facebook's needs don't match everybody else's. And so it's interesting that it's not that Facebook is advocating, hey, like pick everything from scratch every time you do it. It's just that they have their own stack, and then others may have different stacks. So that's something that I think may just drive the fact that like Facebook may not be the right folks to solve that. And I don't know if folks are hoping for Facebook just to make the decision that it's Redux or it's Relay or whatever it is. But like, I think that's more for the role of the community.
Yeah, I agree. So I agree with that too. I think, over time, some of their stuff will trickle. But yeah, I think their problems are so much larger than most of our problems that it probably doesn't make sense for a lot of the stuff. And also it takes a lot of effort to open source something, to make the commitment that, hey, we're going to maintain this and we're going to continue to maintain it. If you look at the, precedents as far as Facebook's concerned, they don't have the greatest one, between, Cassandra and stuff. They're always switching technology stacks, and, for good reason. So I think it's to have to be a little bit more deliberate about what they release and the commitments, and if realizing there are commitments to having that released, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned before the recording that some of your focus lately has been more on the back end side. And so that brought a question to mind for me. So you've worked on the web front end, native front end, the back end. Knowing what you know about the front end, the way apps are built these days, does that change what you think about when you build on the back end? Or do you think there are things that back-end developers that we need to move forward on to better serve the kinds of front ends that are being built these days?
Yeah, so it's funny to say that. I'm a big fan of GraphQL, and I sort of see this as a more of a movement to sort of reduce the role of the backend developer. And I have this theory in my head that eventually the backend developer will sort of be that I don't know, that very low end developer that back in the day, right? That sort of tucked in the back and sort of does his little magic. But there's but anyway, what I see is that with GraphQL, what we're seeing is evolution of pushing more responsibility from what we used to consider back end up to the front end, and so right now what GraphQL means is that we're actually pushing the modeling and stuff towards the front ends to where they have the full understanding of it. And we're not far along. We're not far from a time where it could be that even the front end can say, look, this is the schema that I want. And to me, what more than a technology for API delivery and transmission, I see GraphQL as a technology for communicating how we see our application, and allowing that stuff, that data to be hosted be shared between the client and the back end into the back end, to where it could be where the front end pushes the schema. Hey, look, this is how my app sees this data. You store it the best way you can, and I just want to be able to get it when I need it, and I want to get it in this in these ways, and I will communicate that through GraphQL. So. From that, the way we've changed it, the way we're changing it from a server development perspective is how does the platforms that we work with enable that? And that's one of the things I've been really fascinated with in particular in Ruby and Rails is how do we manage like this GraphQL for the front end developers from a platform like Rails. How does that affect how we handle like models and things and concerns of that nature?
This makes me think. I haven't adopted GraphQL a ton. I'm kind of looking into it and getting it ready in my back pocket for when I really want to reach for it. And I've thought about it in the past, kind of about pushing some of those decisions more onto the front end than on the back end, like a shift in where that happens. But now that you're saying this, it makes me think maybe a better mental model is even just deferring decisions about how you want to structure your data. Just the fact that the front end specifies what it needs. And so it allows the front end to iterate on, I don't need to pull these fields down yet. I'll pull them down on the other screen instead. And just the fact that just nobody needs to decide in advance how that happens. The fact that decision can really be deferred and iterated on. And, as someone who really gets fired up about agile development and iterating, that flexibility really makes me excited. And just the fact that a conversation does not need to happen about which API calls return which fields. That's really motivating to me.
Yeah, that's actually pretty funny. That's very similar to the original NoSQL movement. But yeah, it's going back to that. And yeah, and then that makes a lot of sense. It's actually pretty interesting.
So let's kind of look forward into the future. You and I have both tracked in the industry for a number of years now. You've seen some changes from, back to the point where there was no such thing as front end, like JavaScript sprinkles was all there was. And so things have certainly changed a lot since then. When you lift up your eyes to the 30,000 foot view, where do you think software development is going in the next 10 years? What needs do you see that aren't being well addressed by any of our current paradigms? And what do you think are kind of, fertile ground for kind of future innovation?
I sort of see as the software development, application development has sort of developed. What has happened is that it's pushing application development further up the stack. Is the way I look at it, right? So when I started, one of the most straightforward ways to build web applications was using CGI, right? Which is And then from there, we went servlets, and then now we have these huge platforms. And at the same time, we're pushing up the mental model of what it takes to build an application further up the stack, right? To where I think we're getting to the point where putting applications together may not be a developer level skill, or maybe a regular person skill with some development understanding, right? So I'm looking at things like Airtable and Coda.io, which is which is very much like a similar thing to Airtable, and then also like serverless and stuff like that as a ways of pushing those concerns up further up the chain, to where it would be interesting if we could actually compose applications together like people today compose like cells in an Excel spreadsheet. I think to me right now that's the highest level of software development. But I think people can actually do more than that, right? So and when we look at stuff like Siri shortcuts on Zapier, we're looking at these very rudimentary ways of how people compose applications. But that tooling is sort of meeting in the middle, where these tools are getting more approachable and easier to use. And then at the same time, we're sort of, from a development standpoint, we're pushing people further up the stack, to where it would be interesting, to look at how, one of the things that fascinates me is, I have 2 kids, and they are so comfortable with using a touch screen, more so than a keyboard. They might not see a keyboard until they're in college these days. So what does it mean how does that affect software development when the primary input is not a mouse but a touch screen, right? Can we get to the point where we're like doing these crazy drag and drop Minority Report like things to actually program things? To me, that's what fascinates me. But at the same time, it just means that we're continue to build up on top of what we have today, and try not to rebuild things that we've done in the past.
When I'm building a new product, G2I is the company that I call on to help me find a developer who can build the first version. G2I is a hiring platform run by engineers that matches you with React, React Native, GraphQL, and mobile engineers who you can trust. Whether you are a new company building your first product or an established company that wants additional engineering help, G2I has the talent you need to accomplish your goals. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about what G2I has to offer. In my experience, G2I is linked up with experienced developers that can fit my budget, and the G2I staff are friendly and easy to work with. They know how product development works and can help you find the perfect engineer for your stack. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about G2I.
Yeah, you're talking about higher levels of abstraction to work at. And this reminds me of a podcast episode of a podcast called Copy, Paste, Repeat, with Yehuda Katz, who was influential in the Rails world back in the day, and now has worked for a number of years on Ember.js. And in this podcast interview, it was very helpful for me to start to get the point you're getting at, where it's like, as we focus on software, like a motivation to want to remove unessential details. A big part of his motivation actually is specifically to help new developers get into development. And you mentioned your kids as well, where it's like, what are things that we're having to build that are kind of plumbing, where it's like, hey, this isn't essential to the things that's going to help me deliver business value. These are things that like maybe we can abstract away. And like, I thought about those ideas in general, but that podcast episode with him was really helpful for me to get my mind around it and really get me to be not satisfied with the way I'm building apps in any framework right now, but to want to move to a higher level of abstraction. So I'll paste that one in the show notes as well.
Yeah, exactly. I've been working with this one client, and I see this pattern repeated where I wonder, like, how much time do we actually spend writing code to control how often we do something and when we do something, and as opposed to actually doing that thing itself, like handling concurrency, handling scheduling, all that stuff, and how one job fires another job. To me, is like, we shouldn't be doing that. We should be working on the thing that we're scheduled to do. That should be the thing that we're working on. But instead we're working on, how often do I hit this API, when I get rate limited, and those kind of issues. Whereas suppose, like, yes, that's exactly what, that's exactly plumbing, right? Whereas we should be really working on the business that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, and so much of the appeal of React Native to me is that for the apps, the kind of apps that I work on, it's the level of abstraction that helps me get to the point. We've got declarative rendering, so I'm not having to keep the UI in sync. I just declare what the UI should look like. I get to use these abstractions that work across both platforms because for the kind of apps that I tend to build, those user interface elements are what's needed. And so, yeah, my encouragement to the React and React Native communities is to don't get satisfied with things the way they are. Like think about what other things can be abstracted away. And those architectural improvements to React and React Native are doing the same things. Asynchronous loading is something that we want to roll into React Core so that we don't have to reach for third-party solutions or do it by hand. And so what else can we do? What else can we create third-party libraries to do? What else can we start conversations about whether they can make it into the React Native core or libraries maintained by the React Native community that kind of serves as a community standard. So to build those up so that we can all kind of rise and do newer and better things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the key part of that is we sort of needed the platform to stabilize a little bit, so that the thing that we're doing today isn't deprecated in a month or two, and then we're getting there, and then also what will help is that when we search for things in Google, things that show up there are not techniques that are actually deprecated as well, right? Yeah. So. And that's why, I think that's one of the things that sort of hurt Angular and AngularJS early on. Like when you search for things, you're like, what version does this apply to? And does it apply to this version of Angular or AngularJS? So we need, I think some stability will help us, when it comes to finding solutions and figuring out what technology, what stack we want to build on top of, that we're making good decisions.
Cool. Well, we should kind of wrap up and head towards picks. Real quick first, if people want to stay in touch with you, where are places online that they could keep up to with you and get in touch with you or hear what you're up to?
Yeah, I am infrequently on Twitter, but I think that's the most active I am. So my handle is @CYU, and that is also my GitHub handle. That's probably the second place to follow me. And honestly, I actually I speak more through code than I actually do through Twitter. So I guess I should plug out my, the consulting firm that I work at is RNY Labs. I'm a partner there, and we do, general, software development, everything from React Native to native iOS, Android, web, server development, Ruby on Rails, everything.
Cool. I'm just going to drop a link to that in the show notes, and you can make sure it's the right one. Cool. Well, let's wrap up with some picks. I have a few, and then you could jump in if you have any. Yeah. So my first pick for this week, continuing the theme of being cross-platform, I want to share about a Vue.js-based documentation website generator. So it's called VuePress. Kind of in a trolling way, I have a React Native related website that's built on top of VuePress, and that makes me very happy and excited and feel like a troll. The name of it is really funny because VuePress sounds like it would be a Vue.js version of WordPress, which is often thought of as like a blogging engine. But it's actually the opposite. So VuePress does not have blogging functionality built in, but it's great for other kinds of static sites that don't have blog-related functionality. I think it originated for documentation. I think a lot of the Vue.js docs might use VuePress. But whenever I have websites for some of my minor open source libraries or some kind of sharing some general concepts, as long as it's not blog related, I'll reach for VuePress. It just has a great look and feel out of the box. And if you're like me and you only just want to tweak a color and then be done with it, VuePress is really great. So I highly recommend it. And it's there's even minor things, as much as I don't care too much about the user interface, just minor things about the way the menus work and collapse down on mobile seem really, really nice to me. So VuePress, I would highly recommend. And you don't need to know anything about Vue.js to run it. You're just creating config files and markdown files. It will, run Vue.js components inside of it. And so if you wanted to actually use React web components inside of your website, maybe you'd reach for a different library. But when it's just informative, VuePress works great. Oh. The other plug I will make is for the Atom code editor. I'm sure most folks have heard about Atom. But it's kind of my preference for all of my React development and JavaScript and other kind of development these days. I've used Visual Studio Code. It's definitely great. For new JavaScript developers, I'd recommend Visual Studio Code because of all the JavaScript functionality that's built in. But in a conference talk I recently gave, I kind of trollingly referred to Visual Studio Code as an IDE, just in passing. And I'm not sure if anybody caught it or not. But I said that because I feel like IDEs tend to proactively do things for you. Integrated development environments is what IDE stands for, if any listeners have not run across that term before. They try to proactively do things for you, which are great when they work right, but sometimes kind of frustrating when they work wrong. So I won't throw Visual Studio Code under the bus right now and say the things that are frustrating for me. But if you're using it and you find that it's doing things that you're having to Google how to turn things off, automatic behavior, maybe you want to try something that's a bit lower level. And so Atom is more of a text editor in the sense that I feel like it's more opt-in for those things. Like you can add an extension to do something, but it's not generally going to prompt you and try to proactively do something. So, and Atom just still has tons of activity. There's an extension for just about anything you might want out there. So for React development, I recommend Atom.
I'm a big VS Code myself. I have used Atom quite a bit, and that was what I used before. The thing that I'm actually fascinated by right now with VS Code is the live share functionality. That's the Microsoft thing where you can actually do pair programming remotely, and then also you can actually share terminals and servers and stuff. It's something that I really want to build a lot more experience in. And I think to me, it's a game changer for VS Code.
That's awesome. I've heard great things about that. I have a question about it, actually.
Okay.
So when I haven't tried that feature, but one of the reasons I haven't reached for it is whenever I'm screen sharing using a different app, and it asks me if I want to share just one window, I've learned to say no, because usually I want to share my code and then pull something up in a web browser and then like pull up documentation like in a website and have us both see that documentation at the same time. So I'm curious with live the code sharing in Visual Studio Code. Do you ever run into that as a pain point, or does it provide you facilities to handle that?
I think on the web server, maybe. Well, no, I really don't have enough experience to actually speak to that, but I don't think so. Now that I think about it, you can share servers so you can connect to, but not if you want to show documentation for sure.
But clearly that hasn't been a pain point for you. So maybe, we may approach it differently. My idiosyncrasies may not be everybody's.
Yeah. This is something I definitely want to get better at. And I've seen a lot more. I've seen people use it to where, being able to share servers and being able to share terminals, so you can actually interactively show somebody, how you do your work remotely. To me, that's a fantastic way to do it. And then having an environment where you're doing that typing and you're looking at it and then you're also working on it. To me, that's a fantastic way to go. I mean, what usually do you use when you want to do some kind of pairing?
It's definitely changed over time as features from Slack have been deprecated and things like that. I think I haven't done a lot of pair programming recently where both people are typing in. And so it's usually been whoever is doing the coding will share from their end. And then you get like the other person is just observing. Maybe I think with Slack, you can kind of draw on the screen. If I got into a practice where I was frequently having both people actively working, I would probably need to find another tool, and Visual Studio Code might be the one to go for.
Yeah. I guess if it's more peer like pair programming, then it's not as useful. But one thing I've been trying a little bit more of is doing a little bit more a balance between doing some typing and then letting somebody else doing their typing. This way, sometimes the best way somebody learns is actually doing the work itself, even if it's very mundane typing. But at the same time, sometimes it's good for people to know what they can do based on seeing how other people do it, right? Like, do they sort of figure out, oh, you know what? I'd never realized that I could do it this way and it would be much faster, right? So I've been trying a little bit more of that, where it's a mix and seeing how that works out. So I think in that sense, live share actually works really well.
How about you, Calvin? Do you have any picks to share with us today?
So one thing I have is Airflow. That's the one thing I've been looking at. So Airflow is a directed acyclic graph technology. Basically, it's a workflow engine. That's the easiest way to explain it. So it was developed by Lyft, I believe, and is actually now on Apache. But it's basically a way to run schedule jobs or manage schedule jobs that have very complex state or series of steps. So what I'm beginning to, I have this theory right now working in my head that, we saw have a lot of solutions for fixing how to do web applications. But now what we're finding is that we have all these schedule jobs, or schedule jobs or batch jobs that are just they're all like amorphous in our web application system. That's sort of either it's managed by cron or managed by something that we kick off somewhere, and then we don't have a way to manage. We don't have a central way of managing it. So what I think these technologies are, there's also there's Airflow, and I think Netflix have one called Conductor, and this is like a new way. This is the act of creating a framework around how do we do schedule jobs, back-end jobs, complex workflows. And to me, I'm really fascinating and seeing that develop and seeing where that's going.
Very cool. Yeah. I mean, it hits right on the themes that you've been sharing through this episode about working at the right level of abstraction and finding new solutions. That's awesome.
Right. Yeah. I think we tend to want to build these things instead of like figuring out what's out there for us to use. And sometimes it's very complicated to understand how it's going to be used, how it should be used. And we don't understand it until we're like we're halfway there. We're already building and we're like, oh, you know what? We might as well finish the rest of the way. Right. So hopefully the goal is to try to understand it and say, okay, figure out how to apply it, when the situation arrives.
Yeah. Cool. With that, I think we'll bring this episode to a close. Calvin, thanks again so much for joining in. This is a great conversation, kind of zooming into React Native in particular and out to the big picture of where things are going. So I look forward to staying in touch with you and just kind of seeing how we take these software communities together. So thanks again for joining.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to listeners for joining in. We will catch you next week on React Native Radio. See ya.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.